Have you ever seen a man so strong, yet so afraid of only one thing, losing another person he loves, in a place where the winds of the West cut into the flesh? A widowed cowboy, Grant Holloway, was faced with a painful choice. Either let his two sons grow up alone, or open his heart one last time to a stranger desperate for shelter. And Clara Meadow, a poor teacher who was pushed aside by life, if you were her, would you dare to enter the house of a man full of secrets, and then face his own burning past? If one day fate puts you at a crossroads between fear and hope, what will you choose? Clinging to the old pain, or daring to bet on a home that never belonged to you? We invite you to join us in this story of tears, courage, and healing. If your heart is touched even a little, please like, share, and subscribe to join us on this heartwarming journey. The wind in the Rio Mesa Valley in late winter always blows with a thorny way, as if someone is holding handfuls of needles and throwing them straight into the faces of passers-by. Each gust of wind that blows down from the North Mesa Ridge carries the scent of dry snow, old grass, and the smell of hard days. To longtime Westerners, wind is just wind. But to a woman stranded in the valley without a home, without a job, without support, it is the chill of loneliness. Clara Meadow pulled her pale gray wool scarf up to her nose. Her old leather gloves were cracked, the edges frayed enough to let the wind in. Still, she clutched tightly to the canvas bag containing a few old lesson plans and a spare coat, all she had left after a week of rapid, brutal change. She wished she could hold on to them, to hold on to the fragile dignity that life had not yet crushed. She had taught at Mesa Creek Elementary School for 7 years, a job few noticed, few appreciated, but to her the greatest comfort. Every morning, listening to the children reading, smelling the white chalk and the clacking of the blackboard, Clara felt important. Yet 7 years like that were summed up in a letter of dismissal when the school had to cut the budget. Brief, cold, without an apology. The day she was told to quit her job, Clara thought she could make do. Until 3 days later, the roof of her small rented house collapsed in a storm. The landlord quickly evicted her so she wouldn't be responsible for repairs. Clara only had time to take a few belongings. Her 7 years in that town had vanished into the dust, leaving nothing but emptiness. Now she was walking along a dirt road that led west down the valley. Her mental map held only one place, the Holloway family's Red Oak Ranch. It was about 7 miles from town. Everyone in Mesa Creek knew about Red Oak Ranch, a sprawling estate with hundreds of cattle, the largest stable in the area, and a wealthy but quiet widower named Grant Holloway. She didn't know the man, but she knew Grant to be quiet, straightforward, and uninvolved. He was an old-school cowboy, one who lived by principle, by work, and by solitude. But Clara had nowhere else to go. She carried with her a tiny hope that he might offer her shelter for the night, away from the deadly cold. The wind was so strong that Clara had to stop for a moment. Her boots were soaked with snow, and her feet were so numb that she was unsure if she was still walking properly. She looked up at the sky. A thick layer of gray clouds was rolling across like a heavy carpet, signaling that there might be another storm tonight. A flash of fear crossed her heart, but then she told herself, "Clara, don't fall. Falling here means death." She repeated the words in her head like a small prayer. Finally, as the sun was about to set behind the mountains, she saw the seemingly endless wooden fence of Red Oak Ranch looming out of the misty afternoon. Her heart was pounding, whether from joy or fear she couldn't tell. She picked up her pace, but her knees were weak, her legs threatening to buckle. The only thing that kept her going was the knowledge that she couldn't collapse when she was only a few miles from life. Just as she was holding onto the fence post to keep her balance, a loud bang came from the stables. The wooden door swung open, making a hard clang against the wall. Then a large figure appeared amidst the steam rising from the horses' breaths inside. Clara could see only the man's broad shoulders, his heavy gait, and the dark brown cowboy hat that hid most of his face. Each step he took made the snow under his feet crackle with a low crunch. Only when he got closer did she see his eyes clearly, the dark eyes of a man who had known deep loss, the eyes of a man who had lived a long life in silence. His voice rang out deep like the sound of old pine wood rustling in the wind. What are you doing out here at this dark?" Clara tried to open her mouth, but her lips were purple, and all that came out was a few trembling sounds. She wanted to say she was looking for shelter, but the wind choked her throat. He watched her for a few seconds, his eyes flickering with suspicion, then with a hint of wariness. But when he saw her hands clutching the torn bag and her legs shaking with cold, his expression slowly changed. Not with pity, not with affection, but with the realization that this was not a troublemaker but a soul clinging to the last shred of hope. "You look like you're about to fall. Come inside." Clara hesitated, but the cold made it impossible for her to stand still. He didn't wait for an answer, just inclined his head and walked forward. Clara took a step back in surprise, but then forced herself to keep up. Each step she took felt like she was sinking into the snow, gasping for breath. The kitchen door opened and warmth immediately enveloped her like a gentle embrace. The smell of burning wood, afternoon bread, the smell of leather jackets hanging by the fireplace, it all combined into something that made Clara feel a lump in her throat. It had been a long time since she had smelled real home. The man placed the oil lamp on the table, the yellow light falling on his straight nose and square jaw covered with a light beard. He did not take off his hat immediately, but stood upright and looked at her for a moment, as if considering something. "What is your name, Clara?" "Clara Meadow." Her voice was hoarse. He nodded but said nothing more. He poured her a cup of warm water and set it down, his movements both decisive and awkward, as if he were not used to taking care of anyone other than the two children in the house. Clara looked around. On the chair by the door were small moccasins. On the dining table was a child's sketchbook. The rusty copper stove had traces of ash from a half-eaten dinner. It was a man's house, but there were children in it. She opened her mouth and asked softly, Do you live here alone?" The man looked up and replied in a low voice, "No. I have 2 sons, Luke and Noah." Clara nodded. The 2 boys' names seemed to blend into the wind outside. Suddenly she heard small footsteps on the wooden floor. A boy with dark brown hair and sharp eyes beyond his age stood in the doorway. He looked at her for a few seconds, said nothing, then turned away. She guessed it was Luke. People said he looked just like his father. Noah, the younger boy, was probably sleeping. The man turned back to look at Clara, his eyes strange. Half wary, half as if he had made some decision. "I'm Grant Holloway." His name fell softly but firmly, like when a Western man shoes a horse, each word heavy but true. Clara bowed her head slightly. Grant looked at her for a long time, so long that time seemed to stop. Then he said a sentence that took Clara's breath away. "You need shelter, and he paused, need someone who knows how to take care of children." Clara's eyes widened. Shock ran down her spine. But Grant didn't elaborate. He just said it, and then silence swept the rest away. The kitchen, in its soft yellow light, was somehow suffocatingly tense. Clara looked at him, grateful for his help, but also worried because she could not guess the silent man's intentions. She thought to herself, "I just need to stay here for the night. I'll think about it tomorrow." But Clara didn't know that Grant Holloway's short sentence would be the first step leading her into a completely different life. A life she never dared to dream of. The wind outside still whipped against the wooden walls, creating a lingering sound like someone wailing in a field. But in the small kitchen at Red Oak Ranch, the warmth from the fireplace soothed Clara Meadows' trembling hands. She sat near the kitchen door, her hands cupped around a cup of warm water, as if clinging to the last trace of human life. Grant Holloway stood a few steps away from her. He slowly removed his cowboy hat and placed it on a hook beside the wooden door. The firelight reflected in his eyes, revealing a cautious, heavy look, the eyes of a man accustomed to living in the silent darkness of memory. There was a quietness about him that made one hesitate to ask too many questions, but also unable to look away. Clara looked down at her snow-covered boots. They were torn near the heels, and every step was a negotiation with the cold. She didn't want anyone to pity her, but at that moment she could no longer hide her exhaustion. She tried to find strength in her weak voice. "I just need a place to sleep tonight. Just one night. Tomorrow the weather will be better, and I will leave." Grant did not answer immediately. He folded his arms and leaned lightly against the wooden counter. For a few moments there was only the crackling of the wood in the stove. Finally he spoke slowly, enunciating each word. You can't go out now. The whole valley will be covered in snow by morning. No one can survive out there tonight." He spoke firmly, not to threaten but to describe the harsh reality of this land. Clara nodded slightly, her eyes dry from the wind. But Grant's next words left her completely confused. "But because of that, I need to be honest with you, Clara Meadow." She looked up. His gaze met hers for a brief moment, but it was enough to make Clara feel that something important was about to happen. "I'm not good at talking," Grant said slowly, "and I'm not used to strangers in the house, but I saw you shivering with cold. I saw you walking alone in the snow. That's not a bum." Clara bit her lip. She didn't know how to respond. Grant continued, "There are people in this world who come into a place just to ask for some warmth, but I think you need more than just a night to pass." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, not from the wind but from the truth he was about to speak. "I need someone who can take care of children." He paused, looking deep into her eyes. "And you need a place to start over." Clara stuttered, confused. "What are you implying?" Grant didn't beat around the bush. "I need a mother for my 2 sons. Luke is 11, stubborn and withdrawn. Noah is 7. He has night terrors. They need a stability that a father like me can't always provide." He looked down at his gloves on the wooden table. His voice was low, almost exhaling the weariness he had been holding in for so long. "I'm not asking for love. I'm not gentle enough for that. But I need someone who is kind, someone who will listen, and I think you are that person." Clara sat motionless. Each word fell into her mind like heavy snowflakes pressing down on her confusion. "You want me?" She couldn't finish. Grant completed the sentence for her. "Be my wife." Clara tightened her grip on the scarf around her neck. The words in this context were a double-edged sword, saving yet so easy to hurt. She felt her heart constrict, half fear, half bewilderment. A loveless marriage, a deal based on need. She looked into the fireplace, the dancing flames reminding her that the world outside was much colder. Clara knew she had nowhere to turn, but accepting such an offer, would that mean losing herself? She asked, her voice small but clear. "Why me?" Grant replied, without thinking long. "Because you don't complain, you don't gossip, you don't put yourself down, even when you're standing in the freezing wind." He paused. "Someone like that has inner strength. My 2 sons need someone like that." Clara bowed her head. She was not used to people seeing the good in her. Her life had been filled with cold nods and petty criticism. The atmosphere fell silent. Clara knew she had to answer, but her lips still wouldn't open. Just then, there was a slight noise on the stairs. A boy's voice rang out as soft as the wind blowing through dry grass. "Dad, who's in the kitchen?" Grant turned back. "Go to sleep, Noah." The baby poked his head out, his black eyes flickering as he looked at Clara, curious and a little scared. He was holding a small blanket, his feet covered in woolen socks, his hair disheveled from just waking up. Clara looked at him, her heart softening. There was something in Noah's eyes that was very similar to her own when she was little, fragility mixed with a yearning for the warmth of family. The boy asked again. "She will stay." Grant did not answer immediately. He looked at Clara. His eyes asked a question instead of words. Clara was confused. Noah looked at her with wide eyes as if waiting for an answer from her, not from his father. She tried to smile at Noah, but the smile broke because of the truth she didn't know where she belonged. Grant walked to the kitchen door. He opened it slightly, allowing Clara to see that it was dark outside. The snow was nearly 6 inches deep. The wind howled. "You can't go anywhere tonight." Clara swallowed. Her heart pounded as if it were trying to jump out of her chest. Then Grant spoke the closing sentence, soft but sharp as a knife cutting through the cold night. "As for tomorrow, you must think quickly." He looked deep into her eyes. "Because the storm is not over yet." Space seemed frozen. Clara understood that her life had just taken an irreversible turn. When Clara Meadow awoke the next morning, the dim light filtering through the windows was obscured by a thick blanket of snow. Outside, the Rio Mesa Valley was a white expanse stretching to the distant mountains. The sky was still, the wind had ceased to roar as the night before, but the silence carried the uneasy feeling of a storm that had only paused, never ended. Clara curled her arms around the thick blanket Grant had given her last night. The spare room was down the hall, small and compact but warmer than any she'd slept in weeks. The pine walls were old and scratched, the wood floors creaked as she walked. Everything about the house reminded her of peaceful times before the woman of the house disappeared. She stood still for a moment, listening to the slight stirring of someone in the kitchen. Then small footsteps, probably Noah, running down the hall, and someone whispering softly. Both sounds lightened the chill in the air, but by the time Clara pulled open the door to her room she was still unsure what she would face today. Grant was sitting at the dining table holding a cup of black coffee. The light from the window fell on his broad shoulders, casting long shadows on the wooden wall. Noah sat beside him holding his cup in both hands. Luke sat a little further away, his back straight, his eyes expressionless. Everyone turned to look when Clara appeared. Grant put down his cup. "Did you sleep well?" Clara nodded slightly. "Thank you for letting me stay." No one said anything for a few breaths. Obviously, everyone was waiting for the leftover from last night, an answer. Grant kept his voice even. "The storm won't pass. It'll be cold again tonight, and the days ahead won't be any better." Noah looked out surprised, as if so much snow were the strangest thing in the world. Clara stood still, her hands clasped together. The snowstorm outside was only part of the difficult decision weighing on her chest. What was difficult was the man's words from the night before. Words that had no romance in them, but had touched the deepest part of Clara's insecurities. "I need a mother for my 2 sons. A deal, an offer as straight as the dirt road that ran through the farm." Clara walked slowly to the table and sat down in the chair opposite Grant. For a few seconds she just looked at her hands resting on the wooden table, then gently raised her head. "I'm not used to people making offers like that," she said. "I'm not someone who brings much to a marriage." Grant shook his head. "I don't need much, just stability, kindness." He glanced at his sons. "And someone they can trust." The simple words made Clara feel a lump in her throat. She was not used to people placing their trust in her. After many years of teaching, she had only been used to giving trust, rarely receiving it in return. Luke didn't turn to look at Clara, but he said in a low, slightly stiff voice, "Dad, you don't need to marry anyone. We're fine." Noah immediately shook his head in protest. "No, I'm not okay. I don't want anyone else to leave." The boy's words made Clara freeze. Noah's eyes widened, slightly wet. The room fell silent. Grant pursed his lips, looking at his son with the heavy gaze of a father, helpless in the face of his son's fear. Clara felt that every memory of the 2 children was still fresh. The loss of Miriam, Grant's ex-wife, must have been too great for the whole family. Clara gently squeezed the cup of warm water. The warmth seemed to spread to her heart. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Holloway, I'm not perfect. I've failed at things I should have done right. But I care. I listen, and I know what it's like to be alone." She looked straight at him. "If I agree, I want one thing." Grant sat up straight. What Clara spoke slowly, carefully, without trembling. "Respect. Just that. Nothing more, nothing less. I cannot be someone's shadow. I don't want to be seen as a burden or a replacement. I need to be seen as a family member, not someone brought in for convenience." Grant looked at her for a long time, so long that Clara thought he was going to refuse. But finally he replied softly, "Clara Meadow, respect is the only thing I can promise right now, and that promise I will keep." The air changed. It was as if the thick layer of snow outside had slid off the roof, revealing a thin layer of light. Clara nodded slightly, then let out a long, tormented sigh. "I agree." She said it calmly, without trembling, without haste. As if she had considered it carefully, and what she chose was life, her own and the lives of the little hearts that needed a mother. Noah immediately smiled, a rare smile that made his cheeks flush. Luke looked at Clara for a moment, saying nothing, but his eyes were no longer as cold as before. There was only a hint of confusion, as if he didn't know how to take this news. Grant stood up, pulling his chair over with a creak against the wooden floor. "Then, we'll have a simple wedding. Today." Clara was stunned. "Today? "The storm hasn't passed," Grant said. "It's difficult to get around. Reverend Collins lives nearby. He might come." Clara bit her lip. Everything had happened so fast that it had left her a little dizzy, but then she realized some things can't be left for too long. Life sometimes only gives you a small space to step into the light before the darkness falls. Noah cried out, "You're going to be our mother." His voice was so excited that Clara smiled her first real smile in days. "I will do my best," she replied softly. Luke looked out the window, saying nothing, but his shoulders relaxed a little. Grant went to get his coat and hat, preparing to go out to ask the pastor. Before he walked out the door, he paused for a second and turned to Clara. "Thank you," he said, no flowery words, just sincere. "For agreeing," Clara replied softly. "I hope will do the right thing." Grant nodded slightly, then opened the door. The cold wind rushed in again. Clara stood watching, confused but also strangely relieved. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how many old memories Grant still had. She didn't know how much Luke would accept her. But one thing she knew for sure: she had made the bravest decision of her life. One decision can change your destiny. As Grant disappeared into the snow, Clara looked down at her hands. Though numb with cold, they were trembling with an emotion she could not name. Hope. For the first time in years, hope no longer scared her. Their wedding morning began with the soft neighing of horses in the yard and the rooster calling from the distant barn. It was still early, and a mist covered the wooden fences that stretched to the far end of the field. The old oak trees around Red Oak Ranch were covered with snow, their branches stretching out in strong embraces. The cold air made it hard for Clara Meadow to breathe, but inside she felt a strange feeling, like standing on the brink of a new life, both trembling and calm. Grant Holloway returned not long after leaving home to look for Reverend Collins. His coat was covered with fine snowflakes, and his cowboy hat was half damp. He opened the kitchen door, and the cold air was immediately overwhelmed by the warmth of the house, creating a thin wisp of smoke from his coat. "The pastor will be here in an hour," Grant said, his voice low and curt. "The storm didn't arrive in time so he can go." Clara stood by the kitchen table, preparing a simple breakfast. She could only nod slightly in response. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know if it was from the cold or the great things that lay ahead. Noah ran around the table, chattering away. "Miss Clara, do you want toast or fried eggs? I can make them. Dad, let me use the pan." Grant placed his hand on Noah's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Let her breathe, Noah." Noah pursed his lips, then ran to the window to look at the snow, leaving Clara with a small smile. Luke sat at the end of the table, clutching a thick book, but clearly not reading it. He glanced at Clara briefly, then looked back down. Clara could feel the awkwardness clinging to him. It wasn't hatred, just the stubborn distance of a child who had lost too much and was afraid of losing again. Clara spoke slowly, her voice small but warm, "I think I like both." She looked at Noah. "If you can make it, I will eat it all." Noah laughed so hard he almost slipped on the wooden floor. He skipped to the stove, grabbing the pan with both hands as if it were a treasure. His voice echoed throughout the kitchen. "Daddy, I'll make some eggs for Clara," Grant replied simply. "Go ahead, son." Clara saw something soften in Grant's eyes as he said that. An old layer of ice cracked, revealing a warmth inside that he could no longer hide. Breakfast that morning was prepared with charming clumsiness. The eggs were undercooked, the toast slightly burnt, and the coffee watery. But Clara ate every bite, and no one in the house noticed that she was trying to swallow both food and emotion at the same time. An hour later, Pastor Collins arrived. He was an older man, slightly stooped, but his voice was still loud and full of life. After a few brief greetings, he stood in the middle of the small living room, holding an old Bible. Clara and Grant stood side by side. Neither spoke. They just looked down at their hands, wondering how two strangers had ended up in the same place on a winter morning. The blessing rang out as simple as the land itself. "In the cold winds of winter, God leads lost souls to shelter. In loneliness, He puts faith in hearts. And in families that have been torn apart, He puts a new chance." Clara felt her heart sink as she listened to each word. A new opportunity. The word was as big as the valley to her. Grant didn't give her a ring, he hadn't had time to prepare, but he placed his large warm hand on Clara's. "We'll try every day," he said. "No flowery vows, no words of love, but the truth," and for Clara the truth was sometimes more than all the beautiful promises. After a brief ceremony, Noah hugged Clara. "Welcome, Mother," he said it as lightly as a breath. Luke stood a few feet away. Clara saw his hesitation. She didn't press him. It took longer for someone who had lost a mother to trust. She turned to him, nodded, and smiled. "I hope we get to know each other, Luke." The boy did not reply, but his eyes softened. That was enough for Clara to believe that the small door in his heart was opening. The afternoon came quickly. The sky was overcast, the pale light casting a sad pall over everything. Grant was busy with the ranch hands, checking fences and clearing snow-encroached stables. Clara stood on the porch watching them work. Though he was with many people, Grant was remarkably quiet. He was a man who did more than he talked and spoke only when necessary. Clara put on her woolen scarf and walked down the steps. The snow sank under her feet, making each step feel like a step into her own memories. She wondered how long had it been since she felt like she belonged. She passed the stables. Noah was standing next to a sorrel horse named Marple. He was stroking its mane, his face unusually peaceful. When he saw Clara, the little boy waved. "Mum, would you like to try brushing Marple's fur?" Clara paused. The word mother felt like a warm stone had been swallowed. It rolled down her throat and into her chest, then dissolved into an emotion she couldn't name. "I don't know how to do it yet," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Noah smiled. "I just told you, Mom." He handed her the soft brush. Clara took it and began brushing in the direction of the horse's fur. The horse twitched its ears slightly as if in agreement. Clara wasn't used to large animals, but the action, simple, steady, brought her a strange sense of peace. Noah told her about the horse, about riding with his father, about the time he fell and his father carried him all the way home. He spoke excitedly, his little hands busy stroking the horse's back. Grant saw the scene from afar. He stood still in the cold wind, silently observing. His face was expressionless, but his eyes had a light that Clara had never seen before. It was as if seeing Clara beside her son made some nameless fear in his heart lessen. That evening, Clara prepared the family's first meal. The kitchen was still clumsy, with hands unfamiliar with farm work, but she tried. The smells of mashed potatoes, beef stew, and cornbread filled the familiar air of the American West. Noah helped take the bread out of the oven. Luke just watched, but Clara knew he was observing more than he said. As they sat down at the table, Clara heard the wind whistling outside, and it felt different from last night. Yesterday, the wind had brought only death. Today, the wind brought hope, a fragile but enduring hope. Clara was cutting a piece of cornbread when Luke suddenly spoke up. "Today is the anniversary of my mother's death." The whole table went silent. Grant put down his spoon, his eyes darkening slightly. Clara looked at Luke, not interrupting, not over-comforting. She simply waited for him to continue. The boy took a small breath, his eyes shining with remarkable strength for his age. "I just want to say, I know you're not my mother." Luke paused for a moment. "But I will try to respect you. Like you want." Clara didn't put her arms around him. She didn't want to rush him. But she put her hand on the table near his. "Thank you, Luke," she said. "I'll try to make you feel worthy, too." In that brief moment, Clara felt her heart expand, as if a light had entered after long years of darkness. The evening ended in a soft silence. Noah fell asleep quickly, and Luke sat alone in front of the fireplace, reading. Clara cleaned the kitchen, trying to do everything slowly, as if to memorize every small movement of being a member of this family. Grant entered, leaning lightly against the doorframe. "Thank you for today," he said. Nothing long, nothing flowery. But Clara knew he meant more than those 3 words. She nodded slightly. "First day, not bad." Grant looked into the fireplace, the firelight reflecting off his face, erasing some of the harshness. "We'll take it slow," he said. Clara didn't answer. She just stood there listening to the fire and feeling the warmth, and for the first time she felt like she could begin to believe in this house, even though every challenge still lies ahead. The first morning after their wedding opened with gray skies and a gentle wind from Mesa Ridge. The snow had stopped falling, but the dirt roads leading to Mesa Creek were still covered. Grant Holloway decided to take the family to church because that was the custom of the West. Storm or shine, Sunday was Sunday. Clara Meadow wore a light brown coat and an old woolen scarf around her neck. She stood in front of the small wooden mirror in her bedroom, adjusting her hair. Her wedding day had been only yesterday, but now she faced something harder than the snowstorm, the eyes of the world. She took a deep breath, then went downstairs. Grant was waiting for her at the door, wearing a black leather jacket and snow-capped boots. 2 children stood beside him. Noah was so happy he was jumping in his seat, and Luke looked serious as if he were ready for something. As Clara got into the carriage, Grant suddenly turned and asked, "Are you sure?" Clara nodded slightly. "I can't avoid it all my life." The walk to the church was nearly 3 miles. The fresh snow had made the carriage wheels sink, but Marple walked steadily. Clara sat beside Grant, her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Noah sat behind her, chattering about squirrels in the snowy woods. Luke was silent, glancing at Clara every now and then to see if she was shivering. The Mesa Creek Church sat on a rise. Its white triangular roof, small bell tower, and stained glass windows reflected the pale winter light. As they stepped out of the carriage, Clara could hear murmurs from the groups gathered in the yard. They were right. The poor schoolteacher married the richest farmer. Just been here a few years now, she's Mrs. Holloway. I wonder if she's serious. Miriam's been dead only 2 years, and Grant's already remarried. Clara stood still for a second. Not because the words were unfamiliar, but because they were familiar. All her life she had been exposed to what others were saying. It was never easy, but she had grown accustomed to standing tall and keeping quiet. Noah took her hand and tugged gently. "Don't listen to them," he whispered. "I like you, Mom." The words were as small as a breeze, but they warmed Clara's heart instantly. Grant walked beside her, his face stony, his shoulders tense. He was not a man who showed his emotions, but Clara sensed his quiet protectiveness. They entered the church. The cold wooden floors and the smell of candles and pine gave it an antique feel. When Reverend Collins saw the Holloways enter, he smiled kindly. "Welcome, family," the pastor said, emphasizing the word family. Some bowed to Clara, others just looked at her and looked away. It didn't hurt Clara, but one look made her heart sink. Helen Brookshire, the richest widow in the area, 38 years old, her eyes sharp as ice, her lips pressed tightly together. Helen did not try to hide her displeasure. Whenever Grant appeared in town, Helen tried to get close, and everyone knew she had feelings for Grant. Today, Helen looked at Clara as if she were an intruder. The atmosphere in the church was heavy. Clara tried to keep walking, but an indescribable uneasiness began to rise in her heart. Noah walked beside her, holding her hand tighter. The lecture went on as usual, but Clara barely heard it. Every glance at her back felt like needles. Every whisper, however small, was clearly audible in the silence. But what hurt her the most was not the voices, but the feeling that she did not belong here. When the ceremony ended, Helen came before the family. She did not move away, just stood there waiting. Helen's voice was calm but sharper than a knife. "I heard you remarried so quickly, Grant." Grant looked straight at Helen. "I don't think 2 years is fast," Helen continued without blinking. "Everyone in this town knows how much Miriam loved you. And now," her eyes focused on Clara, "you replace her with a teacher who lost her job." The air froze. Before Clara could say anything, Luke took a step forward, standing between her and Helen. "You can't talk like that to my mother." Helen's eyes widened in surprise. Clara was also surprised. Luke, the quiet, cautious boy who always kept his distance, was standing up to protect her. Clara wanted to say something, but her throat tightened. Grant stepped forward, his voice deeper than Clara had ever heard it. "Helen, you should stop." Helen took a step back, not out of fear, but out of hurt pride. "Grant, I just want you to think carefully. For your family's sake. And for your reputation's sake." "I've thought long enough," Grant replied firmly. She said nothing more, just glanced at Clara once more before turning away. Her contempt was evident with every step she took out of the church. Clara stood still, her breath shaky. "I'm sorry," she said to Grant. "I didn't want you to go through that because of me." Grant shook his head slightly. "It's not your fault. Mesa Creek is a small town. People talk more than they understand." Noah took her arm. "Don't be sad, Mom," he said, his voice choked. "Luke and I will always be here for you." Clara stroked Noah's hair, her heart softening like grass in the spring sun. Luke stood next to Grant, his eyes still slightly red. He didn't look at Clara, but said softly, "I just don't like what they say. Mom isn't what they think." Clara had to swallow the emotions that wanted to come out. She placed her hand on Luke's shoulder so lightly it was like touching a bird's wing. "Thank you, Luke." He didn't answer, just nodded slightly, but that was too much for the boy. On the way back to Red Oak Ranch, Clara sat beside Grant, feeling strangely calm. She knew she was still an outsider in the town, but she also knew that in their small home something was changing. Change slowly, but real. As the carriage passed through the pines, Clara saw the log house in the distance with smoke rising from its kitchen, and she understood one thing. As long as she stands by the people in that house, the gossip outside is just wind. The wind may howl, but it cannot erase the growing warmth in the house she just entered. However, Clara doesn't know that behind their backs, another secret is quietly rising. One secret is enough to shatter this fragile peace. On the afternoon of the return from church, the snow began to fall again. Not the fierce storms of the day before, but fine, powdery flakes that fell evenly on roofs, on wooden fences, on the icy mud paths. The sky was a dull gray as far as the foot of Mesa Ridge, and the valley seemed shrouded in mourning. Clara Meadow sat on the porch steps, cradling the warm china cup Noah had given her. Grant Holloway was checking Marple's horse's halter, and Luke was helping his father gather hay into the barn. Both father and son spoke little, communicating only with nods and low ahas. There was something familiar about the scene, a family moving on with their lives, despite the pain behind them. Clara watched them, feeling both peaceful and lonely. It had only been 2 days, but she already felt her loneliness lessen. Noah ran over and sat down next to her. He leaned his head on her arm, something Clara was still not used to. "Mommy, can I tell you a story?" Noah asked, his voice like a draft under the door. Clara rubbed his back gently. "Tell me." Noah looked up at the sky as if searching through the clouds. "When Mother Miriam was alive, she used to sit here, drinking tea like she does now. She said, 'The valley breeze in the evening sounded like the voice of God.'" Clara smiled sadly. "It sounds like God's voice. Your mother speaks well." "Yeah," Noah nodded. "I miss you, Mom, but I'm also glad you're here." Clara gave the boy a gentle hug. Neither of them said anything else. But Noah's small eyes said the rest, that he was learning to trust her, even if the old pain still lingered. Late in the afternoon, Grant and Luke entered the house. Snow clung to their clothes and melted into small drops that fell onto the wooden floor. Noah rushed over to ask about the stables, and Clara handed Grant a towel. He took the handkerchief a little hesitantly. "Thank you." His voice was warmer than usual. Clara noticed that his hands were cracked from the cold. "Do you have any ointment?" she asked. "Hands get chapped easily in the winter." Grant shook his head. "I'm used to it." Clara didn't force it, but she took the jar of lanolin from the kitchen and placed it gently on the table. "Use it whenever you have time. It hurts a little, but it helps dry out your skin." Grant looked at the jar of salve, then at Clara, his eyes trying to say something he couldn't find the right words for. "You care too much about other people," Clara replied softly. "That's the best I can do." He didn't answer, just nodded. But in that moment, Clara saw something more in his eyes than gratitude, an old wound that was healing. Clara could not sleep that night. The wind whistled softly through the cracks in the door, and the wood creaked with the cold. She got up and went to the kitchen, intending only to boil some water. As the small fire in the stove flickered, she heard a noise in the hallway. Slow, soft like footsteps trying to hide their panic. Noah stood there, clutching the small blanket, eyes wide as if he had just woken up from a nightmare. Clara walked over, bent down, and said softly, "Did you dream about fire again?" Noah nodded, his lip trembling. "I heard wood popping, like that day." Clara pulled him into her arms. "It's okay. It's safe here. There's no fire." She led the boy to the fireplace and sat him down. Noah rested his head on her lap, his eyes softening as she rubbed his back. A moment later, Clara saw a figure coming down the stairs. Grant. He stood a few feet away, watching the scene with heavy eyes, like he was being pulled back into an old memory he had long avoided. "He dreamed about that night again?" Grant asked, his voice low. "Yes," Clara replied, not looking up but sensing the weariness in his words. Grant walked over and sat down near the fireplace. His face was bathed in the orange glow of the fire. Since Miriam died, Noah has been afraid of explosions. On cold nights, the sound of wood cracking would startle him. Clara looked at him. You can hold it to sleep on nights like this. Grant looked down. I tried. But every time I held him, he asked where his mother was. I couldn't bear the question. A silence fell over the three of them. Clara felt Grant's pain, not a sudden one, but a pain that wore away over time. Even the strongest man in the West had wounds that could not be healed by strength. She said softly, You don't have to forget, Miriam. But let Noah forget the feeling of having someone hold him when he's scared. Grant looked at Clara for a long moment. His eyes were filled with gratitude, but also with something difficult to say, as if he was not used to having his heart touched by someone with such simple tenderness. Finally, Grant bent down and took Noah into his arms. I'm here, son. The boy leaned his head on his father's shoulder, letting out a sigh so long that Clara felt all his fatigue melt away in his father's embrace. Clara stood watching the two of them, then turned to clean up the kitchen. But before she could leave, Grant called out softly, Clara. She stopped. Thank you for being here. Just 6 words. But the way Grant said it so slowly and so matter-of-factly, Clara had to look away because her heart suddenly contracted, not with pain but with something opening. A small, warm seed, a little faith. And perhaps a small thread began to connect the three of them together. The next morning, while Clara was washing her face with cold water in a wooden basin, Luke stood at the door. Miss Clara, the boy called, his voice hesitant. What's wrong, Luke? The boy stepped closer, his eyes serious, but a little expectant. Yesterday, I saw you holding Noah. He slept better. I wanted to say. He bowed his head. Thank you. Clara smiled gently. You are a good brother. Luke blushed but pursed his lips proudly. Then he hesitated for a long moment before continuing, Mom. My mom used to sit by the fire whenever Noah cried. I don't know how to say it, but... He took a deep breath. But I think she would be happy to know that Dad and Noah had someone like you. Clara was speechless for a few seconds. She just put her hand on the boy's shoulder. Thank you for trusting me a little. The boy nodded slightly and ran down the stairs. Clara stood there, her heart aching and warm. Her heart was no longer as cold as when she entered this house. But when she looked out the window where the snow was falling steadily, she knew all the warmth here was still fragile. Because every family has its own pain, and every wound must be opened before it can heal. Clara had no idea that opening the family's wounds would inadvertently awaken another secret, a secret hidden beneath the silence of the Rio Mesa Valley. A secret is waiting to shake up the new life she has just entered. 3 days after Noah had been frightened by the sound of exploding logs, the Rio Mesa Valley was blanketed in fresh snow. Not as heavy as the storm earlier in the week, but enough to make everything unnaturally quiet. The sun was obscured by clouds, the light falling like silver, so cold that Clara Meadow could feel her breath condense on her lips. That morning, Clara prepared breakfast for the entire farmhouse for the first time. She rose early, lit the stove, boiled water, toasted cornbread, made fried eggs, and added a pot of oatmeal for Noah. The hearth glowed, spreading warmth into every corner of the wood-burning stove. Clara felt a rare sense of calm, as if she had belonged here longer than she actually had. Grant Holloway was the first to enter the kitchen, his usual calm demeanor unruffled. He removed his scarf and leather gloves and looked at the dishes on the table. What time did you get up? Clara smiled slightly. Since dawn. I'm used to getting up early. Grant nodded. Breakfast looks good. Just a simple sentence, but the way he said it, a little slow and deep, made Clara feel her heart warm like the fire in the kitchen. Luke came down the stairs, next his book in his arms. He glanced at his breakfast, then at Clara. But instead of his usual wariness, he gave a small nod. Good morning, Mom. Just 2 short words. But to Clara, it was like a door opening a little more in the boy's heart. She couldn't hide her joy. Good morning, Luke. Noah ran down last, his hair disheveled, his feet bare, and his little blanket in his arms. Mommy, can I help Daddy feed the horses today? Okay, Clara replied, stroking his soft hair. Breakfast passed peacefully. But just as the family was about to leave, the peace was shattered by a knock on the door so loud it startled Clara. Grant opened the door. On the porch stood a strange man, a long gray coat collar turned up his face, red from the wind. He stood too close to the door, the smell of tobacco in the air. "Mr. Holloway?" the man asked, his voice deep but smooth. "Yes," Grant replied, placing his hand lightly on the doorframe, a clear gesture of caution. "I am Ford Duggan, representative of the Western Rail Company." He held out a small metal badge. "I am here to negotiate the land east of your farm. We want to buy it." Grant's expression did not change. "I refused in the letter. It will not be sold." Ford Duggan smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes letters are better than face-to-face. The railroad will open up a great trade route. Our prices are very good," Grant said bluntly. "I don't need the money. That land has been in my family since my father's time. I keep it." Ford shrugged, his eyes darting around to Clara and the two children. "Your new wife? That was quick." Grant glared at him. Clara saw his jaw tighten. Ford chuckled and continued, "Think carefully, Mr. Holloway. I'll be back in 3 days. Don't make us have to use other routes." Grant slammed the door in his face. Noah clung to Clara's arm. Luke stood at attention, his lips pressed together. Clara looked at Grant, his calm expression for the first time in days rippled with worry. "It's nothing," Grant reassured quietly. "The railroad always wants to expand. But they won't touch our house." Even though he said so, Clara knew Grant didn't completely believe him. That afternoon, Grant left Luke with Noah and took Clara to check out the stables. He told her she should get used to managing the area, as it was the heart of the farm. The snow was falling lightly, and the wind was cold but not too strong. They passed a long row of hedges, where the wind blew strongly from the valley floor. Clara walked beside Grant, close enough to hear his footsteps in the snow. "Is Ford Duggan dangerous?" Clara asked. Grant did not answer immediately. He carefully closed the stable door and then said, "They don't care about the land. They care about ownership." He paused, looking out toward the mountains. "They want to put the railroad headquarters right in the Rio Mesa Valley, and my land is exactly where they want it." Clara clutched the sleeve of her coat. "Do you think they'll do anything to make you sell?" Grant looked at her, his eyes serious. "I hope not. But these big companies are sometimes impatient." Clara felt as if a small stone had fallen into her stomach. "Can't you sell this land?" Grant shook his head immediately without hesitation. "Never. My father died defending this land. I will not let it fall into someone else's hands." Clara understood. This land was more than just property. It was history, it was memory, it was part of the Grant family. They checked the barn, the stables, the barn. Everything was normal. But as they returned to the main house, Clara caught a glimpse of something unusual. One of the barn door latches had been pried off. The wood was sharp and fresh and still smelled of raw wood. Clara called to Grant, "Look at this." Grant leaned down, his brows furrowed. "This mark isn't from snow." Clara swallowed. Ford Duggan. Grant did not answer directly, but his silence was the answer. Clara stepped back. A cold shiver of fear ran down her spine. "What should we do?" Grant stood up, his eyes downcast. "We'll lock all the doors. I'll be on watch tonight." Clara looked into his eyes. For the first time, she saw a hint of genuine concern in them. And that made her understand that the situation was no longer simple. Night fell early. The wind was colder, the snow heavier. The cabin creaked slightly with each gust of wind. Clara sat by the fire reading a story to Noah while Luke sat next to her pretending to read a book but always looking out the window. The boy sensed something was wrong. When Grant entered, he placed the shotgun on the table. "Noah, Luke, you're sleeping in the same room tonight. Don't leave the room without Clara or me." Noah asked fearfully. "Father, what happened?" Grant patted the boy's head. "It's all right, son. Some people just don't know how to behave." But Clara saw that his hand was shaking slightly, and she knew Grant Holloway was not a man who trembled easily. After the two children went upstairs, Clara approached Grant, not too close, not too far, just enough to let him know she was there. "Do you think they will come back tonight?" Grant sighed. "I'm not sure. But I won't let them hurt anyone in this house." Clara looked at him, a heavy but clear feeling welling up inside her. The fear was no longer his alone. It was the family's fear. She placed her hand on the table next to the gun. "Grant, you're not alone." He looked at her for a few seconds. Deep in his eyes, Clara saw something shifting, like a thick wall beginning to show small cracks. Before he could say anything, a loud noise came from the barn. A loud, sharp sound like wood being kicked. Grant snatched the gun. Clara held her breath. The house fell into a dead silence. Someone is outside, someone bold enough to appear in the thick snow, in the middle of the night. Grant looked at Clara, his eyes so serious it sent a chill down her spine. "Go inside. Lock the door." But Clara shook her head. "Mr. Holloway, I won't let you face it alone." Grant looked at her, his eyes flickering behind the firelight. And though he didn't speak, Clara knew he understood her words better than any she had said before. Another sound came. Closer. Louder. And that's when Clara realized tonight was not going to be peaceful anymore. The noise from the barn echoed again, louder and sharper, as if someone was pounding on the door with a hard object. The air in the house seemed to freeze. There was only the sound of the wind whistling softly through the cracks in the door and the tense breathing of the two people standing in the middle of the living room. Grant Holloway, gun in hand, walked lightly to the window. Clara Meadow stood a few steps behind, her hand on her chest to keep her heart from racing out of her chest. The snow outside was falling harder, the wind whipping against the eaves, making each sound more elongated and unpredictable. Grant parted the curtain. "Can't see clearly," he said, his voice low as the wind. "Do you think it was them?" Clara asked. Grant did not reply. His silence was the answer. Suddenly there was a small explosion, not a gunshot, not footsteps, but burning wood. Clara felt her skin crawl. Grant rushed to open the front door. A cold wind rushed in. A shaft of orange light shot into the gray sky from the barn. Thin smoke drifted in the wind. "Fire," Grant said through gritted teeth. Clara couldn't help but gasp. "Fire." In the barn, Grant turned his voice tight. "Go inside and lock the door. I'll go put out the fire." But Clara did not back down. "No. I will help you." "Clara, that's not a joke, I know. But this is my home too." They looked at each other for a few seconds, then Grant nodded vigorously. "Okay. But you have to stay close to me." They rushed outside. The snow was falling heavily, but the fire burned red against the white like a bloodstain on the mourning cloth of winter. Clara could hear the wind blowing across the meadow, carrying with it the bitter smell of smoke. The barn wasn't all ablaze, just one corner was ablaze. But if it wasn't put out quickly, it could spread to the rest of the barn. Grant pulled the hose and Clara threw a bucket of snow at the burning part. "Someone doused it with oil," Grant said, his voice lost in the wind. Clara was stunned. "Are you sure no snow catches fire so quickly?" Clara scooped more snow and threw it on. The wind whipped the flames up. Smoke burned her eyes. While they were fighting the fire, Clara suddenly heard the sound of a door opening in the distance. Noah. The boy stood on the porch, shivering with cold, holding onto the wooden post. Mommy Clara spun around. "Get back inside this instant." But it was too late. The wind whipped the flames up, sending them shooting so high, so bright. Clara thought she could see Noah's past flash before her eyes. Fire, burning wood, explosions, tears streaming down the boy's frightened face. "Noah, come in!" Grant shouted. Luke appeared right behind her, yanking Noah in, but Clara saw it in that moment. Noah's legs were weak with fear he was about to collapse. The fire took nearly 10 minutes to put out. When the last flames were extinguished, Clara and Grant stood panting in the biting cold. Grant tossed the hose aside and looked around with a sharp gaze as if trying to see through the darkness. Clara heard him whisper, "It's not a coincidence. Someone wants to destroy our house." Ford Duggan, Clara asked. "Maybe. But the way it was done doesn't quite feel like it." Grant frowned. "It's more of a warning." Clara shuddered. "Do you think they will come back?" Grant didn't answer, but his eyes said it all. When they returned to the house, Clara found Noah sitting on Luke's lap, his face pale. He looked at Clara as if searching for air. "Mom, I thought the fire was like that day." Clara knelt down and hugged the boy. "It's okay. No one was hurt. Your father put out the fire. Grant stood there wiping the water from his face. His eyes burned not from fatigue but from the reawakening of old memories. Clara looked at him for a long moment. When he turned away, she knew he was hiding his own fear. A Western man can withstand storms, wind, and even railroads, but anything related to fire and family is a wound that never fully heals. At night, Clara brought warm water into Noel's room. The boy was still shivering slightly. "Can I sleep here with you, Mommy?" Clara looked over at Luke. He seemed tired but still awake to watch over his sister. "Can I sleep here with Noah?" she asked. Luke nodded. Clara lay between the two children, listening to their breathing even out. Noah held her arm. Luke had his back to her, but Clara could see his shoulders relax as if her presence reassured him. When they were both asleep, Clara got up and closed the door. She walked slowly down the stairs. Grant was sitting by the fireplace, his coat thick, his face turned towards the fire as if searching for answers. Clara sat down beside him, saying nothing. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was like the company of two people who had been through something terrible. After a long while, Grant spoke. "Are you scared?" Clara looked at the fire. "Yes, but not like the fear before." "How is it different?" Grant asked, his voice very low. Clara thought for a moment and said, "Before I was afraid because I was alone. Now I am afraid because I have someone to lose." Grant looked at her. His eyes changed softer, deeper, as if a corner of him had opened a door no one had ever entered before. After a while he whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you." Clara smiled, not replying. Sometimes the fewest words are the strongest. Around midnight, as Clara left the living room to get some water, she passed the long wooden table by the entrance. There was a small piece of paper on it, not the house paper, not in Grant's or the children's handwriting. There was only one line on the paper, written in black ink, scribbled but full of meaning: "Sell the land or lose more." Clara stood still. The air seemed to be sucked out of her. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Someone had broken into her door. Someone knew she was there. Clara clutched the paper tightly and walked quickly to the living room. "Grant." Her voice was small, but enough to make him turn around. When Clara handed him the paper, Grant read it silently. His hands clenched. His breath caught like a spring. The house fell silent again, but not peaceful. It was the silence of a new storm brewing. Clara understood from this moment. Their lives would never be the same again. Clara Meadow woke before the sun had fully risen, the first light, barely scratching a thin line in the gray sky. She didn't know when she'd fallen asleep, but the exhaustion of the night before still weighed heavily on her shoulders. When she remembered the threatening note left on her door, her chest tightened as if squeezed by an invisible hand. Down in the kitchen, Grant Holloway was tending the fire. He didn't turn when Clara entered, but she heard the faint crackling of dry wood in the hearth, a sound that made her shiver, reminiscent of the night of the barn fire. "Can you sleep?" Clara asked, her voice low but clear. Grant added more wood, his voice as even as the wood of the dining table. "Not much. I'll keep watch until dawn." Clara looked at his broad shoulders, bare with fatigue, and knew he was taking the blame on himself. Last night's fire had not only frightened them, it had resurrected the fear that had held Grant captive for 2 years since Miriam's death. "You can't stay up all night," Clara said, stepping closer. "Every body has its limits." Grant straightened and turned to look at her. His eyes were heavy. "I can't let anything hurt my family." The words "my family" made Clara freeze. It was the first time he had said those words to her in there. But before she could reply, small footsteps sounded from the stairs. Luke appeared, his eyes still red, probably staying up late to look after Noah. He bowed to Clara and opened the kitchen door to get some water. "Is Noah still sleeping?" Clara asked. Luke nodded. He was tired and scared. He held the blanket all night, like the day of the fire. Clara touched the boy's shoulder lightly. "Are you staying up to watch over your brother too?" Luke nodded, a little embarrassed. "I have to watch him. Father is too tired." Grant heard but just pursed, his lips not objecting. Clara saw the self-reproach in his eyes. When Noah woke up, he sat by the window holding his little wooden horse tightly. Clara sat next to him, trying to make her voice soft. "Noah, would you like to go to the stables with me? Miss Marple will like to see you." The boy shook his head. "There's fire out there. There are bad people." Clara swallowed back her emotions. Mother will come with us. Father and Luke will be there too. But Noah clung tightly to Clara's sleeve and whispered, "I'm scared. Mom, don't go." Clara stopped. Noah had never said that before, and it struck her heart like a soft arrow. "I won't go far," Clara replied, hugging the boy. "No matter what happens, I'll be here." Noah buried his face in her shoulder. Clara wrapped her arms around his back as if to keep warmth in a heart too young to bear so much loss. Grant stood in the corner watching. He didn't want to intrude on the moment, but something in his face softened, something Clara had never seen so clearly before. Around noon, Grant said he was going to the east barn to check the locks. Clara offered to come along. Luke wanted to go too, but Grant said he had to stay home and watch Noah. Clara and Grant walked along the fence, leaving footprints in the fresh snow. The air was gray and the wind was light. The snow was falling lightly enough to cover any traces of the night before. Clara said, after a moment of silence, "That note, who do you think could have placed it?" Grant didn't look at her, but his voice slowed. "I don't exclude anyone." Clara shuddered. "Ford Duggan, too." Grant sighed, his face showing a rare anxiety. "Duggan wants land, but the way he acts, he never does little sneaky things like that. He likes to go head to head." Clara looked at him surprised. "So, who else would have had a reason to do that?" Grant stopped and turned to face her. The wind blew her hood slightly to one side. "Clara," he said slowly, "not everyone in town is happy about you being my wife." She swallowed. Helen Brookshire. Grant was silent. Clara unconsciously hugged her sleeve close to her chest. "Does she hate me that much?" Grant shook his head. "Helen is spiteful, but she wouldn't go that far." Clara sighed. "So who else is it besides Duggan and Helen?" Grant did not answer immediately. He looked at the distant mountains, his face dark, as if he were weighing whether to say it or not. "Do you remember the story I told you about the night Miriam died?" he asked. Clara nodded slightly. "That night—" "I'm not sure where the fire started," Grant continued. "Some say it was the stove. Some say Miriam left ashes near the curtains." Clara listened, her heart slowing. Grant looked her straight in the eye, his voice a little scratchy. "But sometimes I think, maybe someone was there before the fire spread." Clara stood still. "Mr. Holloway," her voice was hoarse, "do you believe someone burned down your house?" Grant did not deny it. "I never had proof. But now, what's happening, makes me think again." A chill ran down Clara's spine even though the wind was only blowing lightly. When they got home, Luke was standing on the porch looking worried. "Noah has a fever," he said quickly. Clara rushed inside. Noah was lying on the small bed, his face red, breathing rapidly, his hands hot. Clara placed a wet towel on his forehead, her heart aching. She stroked Noah's hair, her voice trembling slightly. "It's okay, baby. I'm here." Grant crouched down beside his son. "Noah, son, I'm here." The boy opened his eyes weakly, but instead of looking for Grant, Noah reached out to touch Clara. "Mom, don't go anywhere." Clara held the little hand. "Mommy isn't going anywhere." Grant looked at the scene, and for a moment his innate strength collapsed to reveal his deepest pain. The pain of not being able to protect his child from fear. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, holding the towel over his brother, and Clara put her hand on his shoulder, reassuring them both. As the afternoon wore on, Noah fell into a feverish sleep. Clara went to the kitchen to make some warm water when she heard someone standing outside the front door. Grant was talking, his voice low but tense. Clara stepped out and saw Helen Brookshire standing on the porch. She wore an expensive sheepskin coat and a hat that hid most of her face. But her eyes were as sharp as they had been in church. "I heard something happened last night," Helen said. "The barn burned down. It seems your family is in trouble." Grant stood with his arms crossed. "None of your business." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure Ford Duggan is walking around town? Everyone knows he wants your land." Grant did not reply. Helen continued, her voice low but sharp as ice. "Grant, I told you, marrying in haste and bringing strangers into the house will only make things worse." Clara took a step forward. "Mrs. Brookshire, I have done nothing to threaten this family." Helen turned around, looking Clara up and down. "You don't need to do anything. Your mere presence is enough to cause trouble." Grant's face changed. "Helen, stop." But Helen didn't stop. "Grant, she doesn't understand what you've been through. Doesn't understand who Miriam is, and doesn't understand that your old enemies are still out there." Clara paused. "Old enemy?" Grant turned to Clara. "Clara, this—" But Helen spoke first. "There were people who hated Mr. Holloway so much they cursed his whole family. And now you live in his house. Don't you think they see it?" A strong wind blew across the porch. Clara felt the ground beneath her feet shift slightly. "What enemy?" Clara asked, her voice low but clear. Helen narrowed her eyes. "He hasn't said anything." Clara looked at Grant. Grant was silent. Helen curled her lips. "That's all I'm saying. The rest, you'll have to figure out for yourself." She turned and walked away, leaving a heavy gap like a rock falling in the middle of the wooden porch. When she was gone, Clara looked at Grant, not angry, not blaming, just a deep sadness. "Grant, there's something you're not telling me, right?" He avoided her eyes. "Not now, but if it puts our family in danger," Clara said slowly. "I need to know." Grant clenched his hands. "Clara, there are things I don't want anyone else to share." Clara replied softly, "I am your wife." The words hit Grant like a blow to a soft spot he tried to hide. He turned away, but Clara saw the struggle in his shoulders. In the house that was gradually darkening amid the sound of the winter wind passing through the cracks in the door, Clara understood that it's not just strangers out there who threaten their family. It's the secrets Grant keeps inside that could shatter this fragile peace. And tonight, Clara sensed something bigger coming. A crack, not just outside the house, but in the heart of the man she had come to trust. That evening, Red Oak Ranch was enveloped in a cold as thick as a cloak of ice. The Rio Mesa Valley was silent, except for the long, drawn-out sound of the wind, like someone trying to hold their breath. Clara Meadow sat in the living room, the fire in the fireplace flickering intermittently. In the light cast on the wood walls, the house seemed larger, emptier, as if some corner of it were waiting for a delayed confession. Grant Holloway stood by the window, his back to Clara. He had been silent for too long. Tonight his shoulders felt as if they were weighed down with an invisible layer of snow. Clara put the book down on the table and spoke first. "Grant, you don't have to hide anything from me." Grant did not turn. Only his voice answered, hoarser than usual. "You don't understand, Clara." "So tell me," Clara said, her voice slow but steady. "We can't defend ourselves against what we don't know." There was a long pause. Then Grant sighed heavily, like someone who had just lost a battle with restraint. He turned back, his eyes as dark as the night sky before a storm. "There was someone who wanted revenge on me." Clara kept her eyes on him. "About Miriam?" Grant nodded slowly. She sat up straighter. "Tell me." Grant walked to the fireplace and placed his hands on the black wood. 3 years before Miriam died, Holloway Farm had a land dispute with a family to the north. The Hammonds. Clara was silent. "Hammond. Sounds familiar. They used to own the land near the town border, right?" "Yes," Grant said, his eyes seeming to see into another time. "They claim my father encroached on their land. But the truth is the boundaries were never properly surveyed. My father defended what he believed was his, and they believed otherwise." Clara nodded slightly. "Land disputes. In the West, that happens all the time. But this is different," Grant said softly. "The head of the Hammond family, Alan Hammond, is a hot-tempered man. He has threatened revenge on my family. Twice he has tried to bring trouble. I stopped him." Clara swallowed. "Then what happened?" Grant looked at the red flames as if he could see a person in them. "Half a year later, his house burned down." Clara was startled. "You think people blame you?" Grant nodded. "Yes. Although the investigation said it was an accident, Alan Hammond believes I was behind it." Clara was stunned. "He survived. He wasn't home at the time," Grant said. "But his wife and 6-year-old son were dead." A chill ran down Clara's spine, not because of the weather, but because of that great pain standing between them, nameless and faceless but full of darkness. "Grant," Clara whispered, "you're not involved, are you?" Grant looked her straight in the eyes. "I swear I didn't." "But an oath isn't enough for someone who lost his family." Clara felt her heart clench. Alan Hammond is alive, Grant nodded. Disappeared from town for years. No one knows where he is, Clara whispered. And you think he can come back? Grant did not reply. But his silence was the clearest confirmation. The silence that followed was so long that Clara could hear the branches scraping against the eaves. She stood up and walked over to Grant. Grant, she said softly, if that man comes back, who do you think he's targeting? Grant closed his eyes for a few seconds. Me. Clara shook her head. No. Someone like that targets other people's pain, not lives. Grant opened his eyes. She had never seen such fear in eyes. Fear for others, not for himself. You fear for Noah and Luke, Clara said. And for me. For the first time, Grant didn't flinch. He didn't brush it away, he didn't turn away. He just looked at her, long enough for the flames to die down. Yes, Grant said under his breath, I fear losing another one. Clara felt her chest sink, not from pain, but from the fact that the man rarely spoke the truth. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. Mr. Holloway, you are no longer alone. Grant looked down at her hand on his. And you? Are you scared? Clara smiled softly, a sad but peaceful smile. I have survived many kinds of fear. But the fear of having someone to protect is something I have accepted. The firelight reflected in Grant's eyes. Something inside him cracked ever so slightly. No noise, no break, just like the thick layer of snow on a roof, falling in flakes when the sun came up. But that tender moment did not last. The sound of horses came from afar, slow, heavy, steady. Clara turned her head. Grant clenched his jaw. The sound of hooves grew closer and closer, echoing in the air like an old warning. Grant reached for the gun by the door. You stay in the house. Clara shook her head. I won't let you go out there alone. Clara, listen to me, I heard. But I'm also a member of this family. Grant looked at her for a few seconds long enough for their souls to understand each other better than they had in days. Then he nodded, slightly uneasily but sincerely. Okay, but stand behind me. They stepped out onto the porch. Snow was flying in torrents, and the wind whipped at their clothes. The lantern light cast a thin, thread-like streak of light across the snow. A figure on horseback appeared in the white mist. He wore a long cloak, his hood pulled low, his face mostly hidden in shadow. The black horse, exhaling thick white breath, stood still about 300 feet away. Grant shouted, "Who is it?" The figure did not respond. Clara felt a chill run down the back of her neck. Something about the way the man sat made her freeze. Not like Ford Duggan, not like any of the merchants in Mesa Creek. Something older, more durable, and more dangerous. The man moved his hand slowly, pulling something from his pocket. Grant raised his gun. Clara held her breath. But the man did not draw his gun. He threw something into the snow. There was a soft thud. Then he turned. He rode. No hurry, no rush, as if he knew they would find what he had left behind. Grant ran towards the object, Clara following closely. It was a small wooden box, thin, old, and stamped with an eagle, the Hammond family crest. Grant opened the lid. Inside was only a piece of paper. The paper was faded, the writing was crooked but clear. "I'm back," Clara choked. Grant stood still, his hands shaking slightly. No wind, no sound, as if the whole valley held its breath. Clara tugged lightly on Grant's sleeve. Grant nodded, a slow nod, heavy as a sentence. "Alan Hammond," he whispered. "He's back." And in that moment, as the snow fell at its heaviest of winter, Clara Meadow understood that the secret Grant kept silent was more than just the pain of a man who had lost his wife. It is the darkness that can swallow this whole family. And from tonight on, none of them are safe anymore. The next morning, a rare winter sun cast a soft glow over the Rio Mesa Valley, not enough to dispel the chill of the previous night's snow. But even that faint light made Clara Meadow feel a little better. Last night had been a milestone, a challenge, and no one in the house had slept soundly. Grant Holloway sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cold but not yet drunk. His eyes stared into the distance, touching the wooden wall as if piercing through it to memories he had tried to bury for years. Clara came down, a scarf lightly wrapped around her neck. She said softly, "You're not sleeping. Grant shook his head. Impossible. Clara sat down across from him. Do you want to continue talking about last night? Grant looked at her, deep and tired. I don't want you involved in my business with Hammond. Clara replied softly but firmly. I'm not involved. I'm in it. Grant squeezed his hand lightly around the cup. I don't want you to get hurt for something that isn't your fault. Clara looked at him longer than usual. Mr. Holloway, whether it was my fault or not, is not as important as the fact that we are under the same roof. I don't want to be on the sidelines of your life. Not after everything that's happened. Grant didn't answer, but Clara saw his eyes drop not away but as if to embrace the fact that she had come closer to him than he realized. Noah woke up late. He still had a slight fever, but he was more alert. Clara put a warm washcloth on his forehead. Don't go out today, Mom. Noah held her hand. I'm scared. Clara stroked his soft hair. It's okay. Mommy's here. Close to you. Luke stood in the doorway. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, looking at Clara with a strange look in his eyes, no longer wary but as if considering something deeper. Miss Clara, Luke said softly last night. Dad looked different. How is it different? Clara asked. Luke swallowed. I've never seen you so afraid of anyone. Clara stood still, letting his words sink in. Grant was the pillar of the family, the tireless mountain. But Alan Hammond's arrival had not only awakened old pain, but also struck him where he was most vulnerable, the fear of losing the others. Clara put her hand on Luke's shoulder. You know, fear doesn't make your father weak. It makes him more human. Luke looked at her for a long time, then nodded slightly. He began to see her not as a stranger who had intruded into his life, but as someone gentle enough to touch the pain that even he did not dare to touch. At noon, Grant went to the stables. The sky was overcast, with low gray clouds threatening the valley. Clara decided to bring him some hot coffee. When she approached the barn, she saw him standing alone, leaning against a wooden post, looking out at the snowy field. His posture was heavy but determined. Clara handed him the coffee pot and said softly, "You can take a break." Grant took the jar, but his eyes never left the distance. He dared come to the door. And he will come back? Clara asked. A man like Alan Hammond doesn't come back just to hurl threats, Grant replied, his voice low. Clara looked at him, then said what she had been holding back since last night. There is something I need to ask. Why was Miriam alone the night the house burned down? Grant clenched his hands until they turned white. That isn't easy to say. But I need to know. Clara took another step. Everything about this family's danger I need to understand. Grant stood still for a long time. The wind through the stables sounded like the sigh of a lifetime. Okay, he said. That night, I wasn't home. Clara was stunned. Where are you? Grant looked down, his voice dropping like a stone. I met Hammond's men. Clara's eyes widened. But you said, you weren't the culprit. I'm not saying I started the fire, Grant interrupted, but not angrily. Just hurt. But I don't deny. That night, I was drawn into one final conflict. He took a deep breath. They wanted me to sign a paper admitting that my family encroached on their land. Clara could hear her heart pounding. You refuse. Of course, Grant said. Not for the land. For my father. I cannot betray him. Clara understood, and also understood what was about to be said. When I returned, Grant said the house was almost completely engulfed in flames. Clara closed her eyes. A tear fell down her cheek, a tear that belonged not to her, but to all the days Grant had lived with that haunting memory. I was late. His voice cracked slightly. I couldn't save Miriam. Clara placed her hand on her chest, as if wanting to share the pain of the man standing before her, who had lived with a silent wound for 2 years, unspoken. Grant, Clara called softly, stepping closer, her eyes soft as the light in the stable. The truth never kills. Only silence does. Grant looked at her, a long, long time, as if she had just said what he had been waiting 2 years for. He let out a long breath. You are the first person I have dared to say this. Clara put her hand on his arm. Thank you for believing in me. In that moment, in the wet cold of winter, something inside him broke. but gently like old ice cracking to reveal the calm surface of a lake below. Grant didn't cry, but Clara knew that if he were a man who could cry, his eyes would probably be full of tears by now. When they returned home, Luke ran out onto the porch and called Father. Miss Clara, there's a letter. Clara and Grant stood still. Who brought it? Grant asked. Luke shook his head. I don't know. When I opened the door, it was on the steps. Grant took the envelope. It was neatly folded, but there was no seal. Clara watched him open it. Inside was not a threat, not a warning, but a child's doodle. Clara frowned. Noah drew. Luke shook his head. Noah has been sleeping since this morning. Grant looked back at the drawing. A house, a tall man standing in front, a woman at the door, and a child, standing a little way off. But what sent a chill down Clara's spine was the words written in black ink below, whose family, time to give it back. Clara felt her legs go weak, not from fear, but from the confirmation of something. Alan Hammond did not return just to threaten Grant. He came back for a child. A child in the drawing stands apart from his family. Not Luke, not Noah, but it was another child. Clara looked at Grant, her heart pounding in her chest. Did Grant, the Hammond's son, really die the night their house burned down? Grant did not reply. He just looked at the painting. And that silence was the answer that left Clara breathless. Not everything he knows is true. Not all they believe is in the past. A missing child, a father with revenge, a man with obsession, and a family caught in a new fire. Clara understood. They have not faced the scariest thing yet. The scariest thing is coming. The afternoon sky cast a bleak, yellow-gray shadow over Rio Mesa Valley, as if the sun and the clouds were fighting each other, neither side winning. No snow fell, but the cold was quiet, seeping into the wood of Red Oak Ranch, compressing the air so tightly that Clara Meadow could hear her heart beating in her throat. In the living room, the child's drawing still lay on the table. A house, a man, a woman, and a child standing apart. The words underneath seemed to be written with resentment that had been repressed for too long. Whose family, time to give it back. Clara kept her eyes on the drawing from afternoon to evening. There was something about those scribbles, not exactly menacing, more like pain, like a wound that no one would heal. Noah was asleep again, though still slightly feverish. Luke sat on the porch, reading a book, his eyes fixed on the white road in front of the house. He was on guard, the way a boy would want to protect his family. Whether they were 11 or 40, the instinct was the same. Grant Holloway paced back and forth, restless, his shoulders heavy as if he were carrying the gloomy sky of the valley. Finally, he stopped before the painting. Impossible, Grant whispered. The Hammond child must have died in the fire. Clara looked at him. You saw the child's body with your own eyes. Grant paused. That was the question he did not expect. He shook his head slowly. That day, only ashes remained. There was no clear evidence. Clara moved closer. What if the child survived, but disappeared, and was raised somewhere else? Grant clenched his fists, his eyes scanning the darkness between the snow-covered pines. So why come back now? Because the child is grown, Clara said softly. When people grow up in loneliness and hatred, they will return to their roots. Grant sat down in his chair. His eyes held a deep confusion, something the Western man hid like gold in a safe. Clara, he said slowly, do you think Alan Hammond is using that child to get back at me? Clara shook her head. I think the child came to you. Grant turned to look at her, unblinking. Why, Clara replied softly, because that child also lost his family. Like Noah, like Luke. And he wants to know, who made his life like that? Grant put his hand to his forehead. Oh, God. Clara sat down beside him, leaning slightly. A child who carries pain throughout his childhood doesn't necessarily turn out to be a bad person. But he might do things he doesn't want to do, like leaving behind this drawing. Grant looked at the drawing for a long moment. So, this isn't a threat, Grant. Clara touched his hand lightly. This is the call. His eyes met hers. But before he could say more, an urgent call came from the porch. Father, Miss Clara. There are people in the woods, Luke ran in, breathing heavily. The road beyond was no longer white. In the gray mist, a dark figure stood in the pines about 300 feet from the house, right where the figure had appeared last night. Grant took the gun not because he wanted to shoot, but because it was what a Western man had to do when his family was in danger. Clara took Luke's hand and walked out onto the porch, her eyes fixed on the dark figure. But this time, the figure did not stand still. He took a few more steps, very slowly, as if testing them, or wanting them to see better. "I'll be there," Grant said. Clara immediately shook her head. "No. If you go out alone, that's what he wants." Grant clenched his jaw. I can't let him near the house." Clara touched his arm. "Grant, he hasn't attacked. He's just appeared. He's just sent a signal. If you go out there, you're putting yourself in his shoes." Grant turned to look at Clara, and in that moment they understood each other more than they could in long conversations. Clara continued, "Let him know. We are not afraid. We are not running, but we are not trying to confront him either." Grant lowered his gun a little. "You think he'll go? If he wanted to hurt us," Clara said softly, "he would have done so last night." Grant took a deep breath, then nodded. He didn't advance, he didn't retreat. He just stood there with the steady stance of a father protecting his family with calmness, not violence. The figure stood there for a long moment as if assessing. Then, he turned away. He walked slowly into the forest, leaving thin footprints in the fresh snow. When he was out of sight, Luke breathed a sigh of relief. "Miss Clara." "How do you know he won't attack?" Clara replied, her voice soft but sad. "Because his eyes weren't the eyes of someone who wanted to kill someone." Grant looked at her. "So what did that say?" Clara replied. "It looks like the eyes of someone lost." In the evening, Clara sat alone on the porch. There was no wind, but the sky was compressed, as if winter wanted to keep all its secrets within itself. Grant came out a few minutes later, draping his coat over her shoulders. "You're cold," he said. Clara looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Worry is colder." Grant sat down beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. After a long while, Clara asked Grant, "Do you think Alan Hammond was the one who took that child?" Grant looked down. "I don't know. It was a chaotic night. But Alan Hammond disappeared right after the fire. No one could find him. Maybe Clara said he's still alive with some child, or left the child for someone to raise, or—" Clara paused, her voice choking. "Or the child wasn't with him at all." Grant looked at her. "What do you mean?" Clara gathered her courage. "I mean, that child might have grown up more recently than we think." Grant frowned. "In Mesa Creek or Rio Mesa Valley," Clara only answered with a look that made Grant stand up. "Impossible," he gasped. "Impossible." Clara stood, placing her hand on his arm. "Who was this person who frequented Red Oak Ranch before? Who was this person who paid special attention to your house? Who was this person who watched your family more silently than Ford Duggan or Helen Brookshire?" Grant looked into her eyes, and suddenly the strong man took a step back, as if hit straight in the chest by a truth. "It can't be," he repeated, his voice hoarse. Clara squeezed his arm lightly. "Grant, I don't think that person is an enemy." Grant opened his eyes wide. "I think," Clara continued, "that person is looking for his birth parents." The wind in the valley suddenly rose, gently blowing softly into the porch, as if whispering something far away. Grant sank down on the couch, his hands behind his head. "Clara, you say that child is still alive, and it's right here, near us." Clara sat down next to him, her hand resting lightly on his back, a wordless but warm gesture. "And the scariest thing," Clara said slowly, "is that maybe the child doesn't know the truth about his mother's death." Grant looked up. In the eyes of that Western man, there was horror, but also a deep sorrow. And then Clara said what she had realized all along, but had not dared to believe Grant. "If that child is alive, it is not certain that it is Alan Hammond's child." The wind stopped at that moment. Grant looked at her, without blinking, without breathing, and asked Clara, "What are you trying to say?" Clara replied, her voice small but clear as a bell in the mist. Grant, that child may not be Hammond's. It may be Miriam's. And the whole house, the whole valley, seemed to fall into absolute silence. A great truth is about to burst out of the thick snow of the past. The air in the house was as heavy as snow after a storm. Clara Meadows' last words, the child could have been Miriam's, hung in the air like a bell ringing in the Rio Mesa Valley. Grant Holloway stood frozen. His hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. His eyes were filled with confusion, pain, and the deepest fear Clara had ever seen in him. "Clara," Grant said, his voice breaking, "that's impossible. Miriam, she would never." Clara took a step back, her voice as light as the wind. "Grant, I didn't say Miriam betrayed you. I said, maybe she was pregnant without you knowing." Grant paused for a second. His eyes blinked slowly, the gesture of someone stabbed with both pain and hope. "No, Miriam doesn't hide anything from me," Grant said softly. "She always tells me everything." Grant, Clara stepped closer. "There are things women don't say, simply because they haven't had time to say them." The two stood silently together for a few heartbeats. Then Grant sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." Clara knelt down beside him. "Grant, do you remember anything else from that night? Any details?" Grant was silent, so long that Clara could hear the small fire in the fireplace. Then he said, his voice slow and choked, "That day, Miriam sent me to find Luke playing near the woods. When I returned, the house was on fire." Clara took a deep breath. "Which means, if Miriam was in the house with another child, he wouldn't know." Grant looked up, his eyes red. "You're saying—" "I left when Miriam needed me most." Clara put her hand on his. "No one knows what will happen. Don't blame yourself anymore." Grant took a deep breath, then let his hands fall. "I have to see him. I have to hear the truth from Alan Hammond." That afternoon, Grant prepared the horse. But this time Clara was adamant. "I'm going with you." "No." Grant shook his head. "Alan Hammond is dangerous, Clara." She held his gaze, not retreating a step. "Grant, you need someone by your side. Someone who can see what you're missing. Someone who isn't blinded by the past." Grant was silent. And then, for the first time, he did not refuse. They rode through the snow-covered road towards the edge of the forest, where the figure had appeared. The sky was turning dark quickly, the light was fading like water. The cold wind cut through the skin, bringing with it a feeling of unease. When they arrived, Grant's horse stopped before an old, dilapidated log house hidden in a clearing. The door was ajar. Thin smoke drifted from the chimney, and the smell of burning pine resin hung in the air. Grant dismounted first. Clara followed, her heart pounding but her pace steady. Grant pushed the door open. Inside, a thin but sturdy man sat by the fireplace. His hair was long and tangled, his chin was lightly stubbled, his eyes were deep and tired. But his gaze was as sharp as a freshly sharpened knife, the gaze of a man who had lost more than any other. Alan Hammond. He was not surprised to see them. "Grant Holloway," he said, his voice hoarse as a burnt wood. "I expected you." Grant gripped the stock of his gun. "You sent the drawing, and the box. What do you want?" Alan chuckled. "I want the truth." Clara took a half-step forward, keeping her voice calm. "Mr. Hammond, who is the child in the drawing," Alan looked straight at her. "He's my son." The answer made Clara shiver. "But," Clara said softly, "that baby didn't die in the fire." Alan shook his head, his eyes sunken. "The day my house burned, I was out in the stables. I heard my wife screaming. But when I got there, the fire had engulfed most of the room where my son slept." He paused, his breath ragged as if pulled back by memory. "I rushed into the fire. I searched in the ashes, but I did not find my son's body." Clara shivered. Noah had been afraid of the sound of exploding wood. Luke had lost his mother to fire. She couldn't bear another child living with the same fear. "Who do you think took the baby?" Clara asked. Alan looked at Grant. "I think it was you." Grant jerked. "I never—" "Shut up!" Alan shouted, his voice breaking in the abandoned house like a boulder rolling off a mountaintop. "You couldn't save your wife. Why should I trust you not to take my child?" Grant's eyes reddened, his voice heavy as snow seeping into flesh. "I was late. I lost my wife because I was late." but I never touched your child." Clara stepped forward, her voice softening a notch. "Mr. Hammond, if the baby isn't dead and isn't with you—" "Where is it?" Alan looked down. "I don't know. I've been looking for 2 years. No one knows. No one has seen." Clara looked at him for a long time, a moment so long that she could hear the heartbeats of all 3 people in the house. "Mr. Hammond," she said, "there is one detail you have overlooked. The drawing the child sent us was not hateful. It was nostalgic. The child was looking for its family." Alan looked up. "His family is dead." Clara shook her head. "No. The child believes her family is alive." A breeze blew in through the window, carrying a few dustings of snow lightly touching Clara's neck. Grant turned to Alan. "If the child is alive, it must have been saved from the fire by someone. Saved and hidden." Alan looked at Clara. "Who do you think did that?" Clara answered slowly, firmly. "I think that person is Miriam." Alan took a step back, eyes wide with panic. "No, it can't be." Grant stood still. Clara continued, her voice soft but sharp. "If Miriam had heard the baby crying in your house, if she had gone in there trying to save the baby from the spreading fire, she could have taken the baby out of that house. And when she came back, the fire had consumed her." Grant took a step back as if struck hard by the truth. "No, Miriam, she didn't say. I didn't see any baby." "Because you're late," Clara whispered. For a few seconds no one moved. Only the crackling of the fireplace confirmed the painful truth that all 3 had connected. Miriam died saving Alan Hammond's child, and that child didn't die. Alan collapsed into the wooden chair as if his legs no longer had the strength to hold him up. "God," he sighed. "For 2 years, I've been cursing the wrong person." Grant stood there, his eyes red as fire. "Alan, if the baby is alive, where could it be?" Alan looked back at Clara, as if she were the only one in the house who could see every piece of the puzzle. Clara spoke slowly, each word fading into space. "Mr. Hammond, the child did not go far from where it was lost." Alan stood up, trembling slightly. "Who raised it? Who?" Clara looked deeply into his broken eyes. "I think that child was kept by someone in town, protected, hidden, maybe, to avoid being caught up in the feud between the 2 families." A strong wind blew in the window. The flames swayed. Alan asked, his voice almost pleading, "Where is that child now?" Clara stepped out onto the porch, looking out toward Red Oak Ranch, far down the hill. Warm light shone through the window. There were 2 children sleeping. There were old wounds, slowly healing. There were lives finding each other. Clara turned back. Her gaze was so gentle that it made the 2 men in front of her hold their breath. "Mr. Hammond," Clara said softly, "if the child is alive, it is very near you." Alan shuddered. "What do you mean?" Clara replied. "The child came to him. It was he who left the drawing." Alan's lips trembled. "My son is looking for me." Clara nodded. And she was scared. She was alone. She didn't know who was telling the truth, only that she was caught between 2 pasts. Grant put his hand on Alan's shoulder. "We will find it. Not with anger, with the truth." Alan bowed his head, tears falling into his calloused hands. 2 years of resentment, melted like snow touching fire. Clara stepped closer to Grant, and it was then that she realized this wasn't just Grant's story or Alan's. This was the story of people who thought they had lost everything, but were given a chance to start over. Clara looked at the 2 Western men standing side by side. One had lost his wife, the other had lost his child, and said, "Tomorrow, we will go find that child." Grant looked at her for the first time without defense, without fear, only trust. "Together," he said softly. Clara smiled. "Together." Outside, the snow began to fall, light, thin, pure, as if winter had finally given way to a new beginning. A beginning where every wound, Grant's, Alan's, the children's, Clara's, has a chance to heal under the roof of Red Oak Ranch. Have you ever seen a man so strong, yet so afraid of only one thing, losing another person he loves? In a place where the winds of the West cut into the flesh, A widowed cowboy, Grant Holloway, was faced with a painful choice: either let his two sons grow up alone, or open his heart one last time to a stranger desperate for shelter. And Clara Meadow, a poor teacher who was pushed aside by life. If you were her, would you dare to enter the house of a man full of secrets, and then face his own burning past? If one day fate puts you at a crossroads between fear and hope, what will you choose, clinging to the old pain, or daring to bet on a home that never belonged to you? We invite you to join us in this story of tears, courage, and healing. If your heart is touched even a little, please like, share, and subscribe to join us on this heartwarming journey. Everyone has their own unspeakable losses in their lives, but Grant and Clara's story reminds us that in the end, it is not strength that saves us, but kindness. We all come to understand that silence is sometimes a cloak that covers old wounds, and only when we open our hearts can healing come in. No matter what age we are, we all need a place to return to, and one that can also be a place of peace for others to rely on. Sometimes the past that seems to have burned all hope is the seed that sprouts for a new beginning. And when we are brave enough to forgive, to understand, to hold someone's hand, life will give us back the things we thought were lost forever. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you feel it touches a part of your memory or heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue with us on the next emotional journey.